Welcome to Knife Skills Live. We have a really special video today. First of all, Tommy and I are in the same room for the first time since the beginning of the pandemic when we started the Knife Skills channel. And Tommy, I will proudly say, is the second most famous person to come out of Stanford neuroscience next to Andrew Huberman. Now here's my question for you, buddy. When you were at Stanford, was he real? Did he even exist? Was he a thing, or what was the situation with Andrew?
I think I'm too young to know who's the famous doctors in Stanford, but I feel honored to be here, Rich.
Well, we're glad to have you here, and it's nice to be once again here in person. So, what we're talking about today is a new topic for us. Sometimes we talk about injuries, sometimes we talk about people who've had strokes and stuff like that, and medical things, but another topic that I think people find maybe could use some information is this challenging process of becoming a doctor in Canada, especially if you trained overseas. My own personal anecdote here is we're both assistant professors here at Western University, and I can proudly say that neither of us got into the med school here. So that says a lot about both admissions of med school, but also what it's like to get to where you want to be, even if there's certain barriers up in your way, right? And so we want to talk a little bit about that process of becoming a doctor when you're training overseas. So maybe do you want to give a really quick background of sort of how you got to Western eventually as a staff consultant neurologist?
Yeah, it's a long road. So I went to University of Toronto for undergraduate school and Bachelor of Life Science. And at that time, everybody just wanted to be a doctor, right? So
Sure.
I'm going to do science. I'm going to pick the best university. University of Toronto is known for to be a good school, right? So, but guess what? You enter a school with a bunch of smart people. Your GPA kind of tanked a little bit, and then so it made it more difficult to apply for medical school. As probably most listener or viewers here, they know that to get into medical school is not just simply about marks, right?
Well, can I pause you for a second? So you went to a really competitive undergrad program.
Yes.
Do you think that in and of itself was a disadvantage? Like, for example, if everyone wants to do medicine, you're being graded on the curve and you're at a program, I would imagine, University of Toronto is an excellent school. Like, we recognize that's internationally known, one of the best undergraduate programs in Canada for sure. But yet, who you're competing with in those classes, does that make a difference? Or do you think maybe
100%? I think it made a huge difference because there's only so many spots, right? So they would allow per school, let's say, even for getting top marks in class, they would bell curve you down, let's say University of Toronto, which is crazy. And so I think choosing the right program for undergrad is the first step in terms of your success for medical school. And I don't want to say I made the mistakes, it was a learning lesson.
I mean, you got to where you wanted to go, and I know you would have learned a lot at Toronto, and so I'm sure that was great. I guess the question is, what kind of program would you recommend if you could do it again, if you make the road a little bit easier? I'll tell you where I went to the Bachelor of Health Sciences program at MAC, which is fairly well known as almost a pre-med program. It's not, of course, and anybody who's a BHSC person, you know what I'm talking about. They really grill within us that it's not a pre-med program. But a lot of people do decide to choose medicine. And I think one of the advantages of that particular program is it allows a lot of flexibility in course selection. So you can get the grades you almost want by taking the classes that you're going to succeed in. And when it comes to applying to medical school, very often it's not necessarily a totality of your grades. It's oftentimes the top proportion of your grades that matter the most. And so a program that you can have a lot of flexibility and take classes that you're going to do well in can be one of the simple things you can look for if you're trying to pick a program. But I'm wondering where would you have gone instead had you had the opportunity?
You know what? It doesn't matter. Anywhere but Toronto.
Okay.
The answer is anywhere but Toronto. But
would McGill not be the same way? I'm trying to think of other there are other tough big universities like UBC. I mean, or do you think Toronto in particular?
I think Toronto in particular is notorious for especially the downtown campus is notorious for people who just want to prove that they're really good, really smart, and so they would discourage you, and then nobody will get good grades there, and it's just very difficult to get a good mark there. And then it's ultra competitive. So it's you know how people in Toronto, if you study in Toronto, you just live at home. So you don't really have that college, university life.
Right.
So you basically go to school and then it's like, hey, I'm competing with all my classmates here and I go home. But as opposed to, let's say you're in McMaster or Western London, I feel like there's some kind of a support program system where you kind of like ask around and say, hey, what should I do to pursue medicine? And I think from the social aspect, it also helps you to have a good balance.
When you're an undergrad, it can at times be cutthroat. I can remember one particular story that comes to mind is in my undergrad program, there was a student who was a strong student, good friend of mine, and she said, I'm going to go into physiotherapy. This is what she always said every day when you said what your plans were, what your goals were. And lo and behold, my very first day of medical school, guess what? She's there. And I said, what? I'm like, you said consistently you want to do physiotherapy. And she said, well, I didn't want people to like feel like I was competing against them for a spot, because she was concerned that people might treat her differently if they saw her as competition. And so she felt like, you know what? I don't want to be seen as competition. I'm not competing with you for a med school spot, so we can work together well, so we can be good partners, that you're going to, help me rather than hurt me. What's crazy about this reality is that there are medical students or undergrads who think that way, that I got to get my leg up over that next person I'm competing. When in reality, that's like one of the worst habits you can have. When you think about the character to be a doctor, teamwork is one of the most critical things. And the last thing you want to do is have this attitude of competition as an undergrad. So there is this, at least fear, if and maybe in some case real, that you might be competing against your colleagues. Another example, this is before everything's online. I remember hearing stories of people like tearing pages out of textbooks in the library so that people could like find the answers to certain subjects when they were studying. I don't know if this is true in Toronto, but I've heard this in other schools. But that kind of cutthroat experience is out there.
Yeah, I think that's probably true, especially with in undergrad school, right? Once you get into medical school, it's different, right? Like you know that like, hey, you all made it. Now you just are trying to select your specialty of interest. But still, still there's competition depending on the program you're trying to get into for your specialty.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more of that later on in the program about specialty selection, how that helps you where you're at in your path. But you're absolutely right. The competition in healthcare, I mean, there's even competition among consultants to a certain level. I mean, we're competing against for grants and other things. So competition is real. It's not a bad thing necessarily, but it's the kind of character that you have when you're dealing with competition that matters. And I think undergrad is a particularly tough place. Also, people are young in undergrad.
Yeah, exactly. You're 18, you're 19. The first time you're living outside your family, out from your family, living by yourself. You have to learn to be independent. At the same time, compete with all these smart people. And like you make mistakes, and sometimes you hope that like those mistakes will not haunt you for life, right? But thankfully, like we're here.
Well, one of those, it's funny because I mean, people do make big mistakes in undergrad. I'll tell you another story. I remember my roommate. This guy was named Roman. I haven't seen him in years, and he was an engineering student, and we had a slightly different work ethic, I will say, and Roman was not invited to come back to university in second year because of his performance. And so he may have missed some opportunities in his life by not focusing on school. I was obviously in the opposite end. I was the kind of person who was focused and wanted to become a doctor. So, that was my priority completely. And one reality, I mean, there are people who are lucky. We have good friends of ours who are, exceptionally intelligent, exceptionally uniquely gifted in academics, despite limited effort. Those people are not necessarily the ones you want to model, but there are people who can really go through undergrad and not miss out on anything. But I can tell you from my experience, I'm sure yours as well, Tommy, is there were a lot of personal sacrifices to get the grades that we did get. Right, we weren't as active in maybe the social life as we would have liked to have been. We didn't go to the same parties that we would have if we weren't trying to become a doctor. That's the reality of competing to get into med school.
Yeah, I think who you surround yourself with too, right? I think university is a time where like if you surround the people who parties all the time, like you're not gonna have time to study, right? So I think that it takes a sense of maturity to go through the medicine path. It feels so long ago, like just an undergrad. And I didn't know what I was doing. I honestly didn't know what I was doing. But I learned but failing in undergrad is probably the biggest lesson I've learned and made me who I am today, though.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. So you mentioned that your grades weren't where they needed to be. How close were you to being above the minimums or whatever for Canadian schools? Like, how far off were you?
That's a very good question. Because I still remember the day of my graduation, I was with honor with high distinction. I just made the cutoff. So I was sitting in the graduation, I was sitting next to all the people who have the highest distinction, but I just made the cutoff. So I started asking them, I was like, what's your grade? What's your grade? That's what people do like back in the days, right? Yeah. I realized all of them got higher marks than me, and all of them are applying to medical school. And I realized I was just, okay, I'm applying too, but I have the lowest mark among all the people I talked to today on my graduation day. So I was like, okay, so my chance is pretty low, and I don't feel too good about this. So it's like one of those feeling like you feel like you have a chance, but you know you don't have a chance, because you know that like everyone else is better than you. It was the day of my graduation was actually a very sad day from undergrad.
Because of that conversation.
Because of that, you felt really good. You're like, hey, highest distinction. But no. There's like 100 people sitting next to you are all above you.
And they all seem to want to do medicine.
Oh, sure. yeah. Or graduate school.
Yeah,
or like professional
right.
degree and stuff, yeah.
So then you would have applied, I assume, to Canadian schools. And how did that process work? So in Canada, the application is OMSAS. For Ontario. Sorry, not Canada, Ontario. And I can only really speak to Ontario. So the application process goes to the Ontario Medical School application system, and that's OMSAS. And so essentially it's a standard way. It's online that you put your application together, and then it goes to all the schools that you want. So I assume you went through that process.
Yeah, I did. So like you have to make a cut off for your GPA, obviously, so your mark, and then you need a good MCAT score, so like the medical entrance exam, which I scored like pretty decent. Yeah. But my GPA wasn't high enough, like what I was saying. So
was it below cutoffs essentially?
I think now I look back at it, like afterward, actually, not now. Like I was below the average mean of people who would get into.
But Canadian not below the cutoffs though. Below the mean, but not the cutoffs.
Yeah. So like I would have qualified to make it to apply for it.
Okay.
But then like you realize people are way above that mark when they got in. So that bar is like people way above that bar when they got in.
In full disclosure, like when I applied to Western University, I was like, my MCAT score was not strong enough for Western. So I didn't get an interview at Western. My interviews were Ottawa and Mac, which did not require the MCAT back then. Mac has changed a little bit. Ottawa, because it was a bilingual school, and MCAT was only offered in English. They didn't have MCAT scores. Ooh. Yeah, so that made Ottawa an option. And I had very strong grades. So I had the opposite problem. So my grades were extremely strong. My MCAT wasn't. Now, I had my attitude. I did the MCAT actually after my very first year of undergrad. I didn't do it again. So I didn't do it like later. And I never taken university physics or anything. It actually wasn't that part that was a problem. It was the verbal reasoning. And I realized probably if I had taken it again, I would have done better, because I think my skills at reading and comprehension improved over university. So I actually may have had an opportunity. But I was fortunate enough to get into med school. I did get an interview in Toronto, but they rejected me. There was one MCAT school I applied to that actually gave me an interview. But in the end, it was only Ottawa and Mac that accepted me based purely on grades plus a few extracurriculars that they seemed to like. But that was basically it. And that was my story. But it does get to the point where sometimes you'll have undergrads who will think, oh, like I want to go to this school like Toronto or Queens or something like that for some particular reason. The reality is that in Canada, get into med school, that is, you get past that hurdle, really then the doors definitely open up for you there. I think that's for sure. If you want to be a surgeon or a neurologist or a family doctor, it doesn't matter which school you go to. And I think people get a little bit messed up and thinking, oh, I got to go to one particular school. You want to go to school where you'll do well. But it's not any particular school.
I don't even think that you have to go to a particular school for undergrad, for med school, for residency, for fellowship. I think along the way, you should have one school that has a good reputation for the things that you want to pursue in life. So let's say that journey I just mentioned, just one part of it. If you can highlight Toronto or whatever, Stanford I went to, like just part of that path. It doesn't matter if it was undergrad or postgrad. It's still part of your resume. Yeah. So I think that's the kind of the thing that back in the days when you were young, you don't think that far in advance. You just say, hey, I want the best name, I want the best place right now, right now in front of me, and so that I could succeed right now. But that's not true.
So let's talk about that moment where you're applying so I assume it just was kind of a closed door at that point, or
I was like in tears. I was like crying.
So when did you feel the rejection? Because you explained to me that you felt fear and disappointment on your graduation day, but was it after the applications went out and you didn't get a response you wanted?
Yeah, because obviously you applied before the graduation. So then like you were kind of hopeful because you just look at the criteria like, yeah, I got this extracurricular activity. I met the cutoff. My MCAT was good. And then you start talking to people. Oh, have you heard any news back? Have you heard any news back? And you find people started getting matched. And you're like, wait a second, I'm not hearing anything back. And then until the day of graduation, you realize now you know why. Because your mark is not high enough because everyone is higher than you. So it's kind of like every day after application, you feel like your hope just gets pushed down more and more until the day of graduation. You have no hope. That was how I felt that day, and I was like, I had no job, no postgraduate school. I was like, what am I doing right now?
So grad really was that moment where you're like, okay, I haven't heard, their grades are better. Now what?
Yes. Yeah.
So you then decide, look, it's my dream to be a doctor, which is the funny thing about this, now that we're in practice, we realize that one of the things we realize about being in practice, and I'll tell you more than anything, is that, being a doctor is an absolute dream and you should be passionate pursuing it. But I also think to myself at this stage of my career, I'm like, man, I wonder what life would have been like had I done something else. Like it's a strange reality. I mean, I only know medicine, but there's so many other wonderful paths that you can do well and succeed at. And it's strange because for me, at that age, and your early 20s, right? I was 21 roughly around that time. I couldn't imagine doing anything else. That was, and that's okay. It's good. That drove me. But I'm in my 40s now. I could definitely imagine doing other things.
That's a good point because at that point, I could not imagine if I could do anything else, and I didn't make the cut. So I'm like, what am I doing with my life?
Yeah.
So I was like, I didn't know what to say to my parents. And coming from a very cultural background, they're like, you need to be a professional and blah, 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 right? And I'm like, I didn't make it, daddy. And then so I'm like, so it was tough.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure they were supportive, but at the same time, you're trained not to disappoint, right? even though I'm sure they were very supportive and cared and recognized that, there's a lot that they could support you in. It's still hard. You feel like you let them down. So then I know that you decided to pursue training outside of Canada.
Yep.
Now, a couple questions there. First of all, like, is the timing application process different? Do you need to wait a year? Like, how, where are you at here in sort of the calendar year and what you're doing between grad and ultimately ending up in med school?
Yeah, so that's a good question, right? So most people who do not get into medical school, and I'm sure you know this from your colleagues or your friends who did not make the med school, they would do like, okay, I need to boost up my resume now if I want to be a doctor, so let's do like a master's degree or something. So I apply for a graduate degree and master, and I didn't get any response. So I'll be like, okay, like time, I need to do something. I don't want a gap year because the last thing you want on your resume is a gap year of nothing. And then when people look at your resume, they'll be like, okay, that's a red flag. So I applied to like a postgraduate co-op programs in Humber for regulatory affairs. So at least it's kind of related to medicine application for like drugs, for example. But then at the same time, I'm like, okay, I need to explore elsewhere because I know that I could not. I didn't have the marks to make the cut in Canada. So I'm like, okay, let's look at the Caribbean. Should I look at the UK, the Ireland? Because I've heard of those places before. But then I knew a friend who was studying in Australia at that time, and she was already like in third or fourth year of medical school and was just telling me about the program. So as you know, Australia is a different season. So they start in January. So
that's like our August.
Yeah. So I actually have 1 year where I had to do a postgraduate degree so that I get at least a backup plan and then apply to Australia at the same time. So from the day of I graduated from undergrad, there was about a year and a bit where I was doing something that's non-medicine related. And I started in January. So about like 6 months later than most people would start here, let's say in July.
So let me understand this. So you graduated undergrad.
Yep.
But it wasn't the next January. It was
January.
January.
I did a year of like a postgraduate, like a co-op program with regulatory affairs with Humber.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then but during that year, I really applying for Australia.
Is that are you getting undergrad credit for that? What are you getting for that?
It's like a diploma certificate.
Okay.
But it's a co-op program, so they help you with job search and all that. So it was kind of a really good backup plan.
Well, let's talk a little bit about foreign med schools a little bit. So one of our best friends actually went to Grenada, and we're quite close to him. And you chose to go to Australia. Was there obviously the climate was a factor. Australia's kind of interesting place. It's similar to Canada in the sense that the culture of Australia is very similar to Canada. I can understand those reasons. Was there any other particular thought process there?
For sure, because I knew that it was very common for Canadians to go to the Caribbean because of they just have a lot more spots. But the biggest and number one issue or the priority for me is that I want to ensure that if I do not make it back to Canada through the match with residency, that I would at least be able to work in that country. And so, for example, places like the Caribbean or even in Ireland, like there's a lot of these policies where you're not allowed to stay after or even in a year. So in Australia, I know that if I wanted to, after graduation, I could continue to work there and get my PR. And like what you said, weather, and it's a Commonwealth country, so it was. And then I had a friend there too. So, but knowing that I would have a job after was very key.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like going to Australia and living there is not the worst thing in the world.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah,
so
I almost decided to stay. So that was the right decision for sure.
So now, what is it about Australia that makes it easier to get in? Presumably, their standards for applying were a little bit different than Canada. What's the situation there? Because I mean, Australia is so similar to Canada in many ways. I would assume it'd be as competitive, or what's.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. So, they have a certain amount of spots for foreign graduates, or applicants, sorry, and then you still need a good grade. You still need MCAT, and then so I made all those cutoff though. But I guess because of the competition that you're going against, so they would have. You're not competing against the local. You're competing against the foreign applicants. So it's a different pool that you're competing against. So I think at the end of the day, it's all about timing. And going back to the first thing we said, you are competing with people because it's a big school too. So like the university like that I was in Australia was in Brisbane, University of Queensland. They have like 13 affiliated hospitals. So they could accommodate a lot more students and more spots. So more foreign spots, more local spots. It's all a numbers game at the end of the day.
We both are professors here at Western. How does the medical curriculum look differently in Australia, or is it like basically the same?
In med school, I think it's very similar.
Okay.
Med school is very similar in terms of the lecture and then problem-based learning and a small group, anatomy class. All is very similar. The difference is clerkship.
Okay.
Because
so explain what clerkship is, because not everyone may know actually what we mean by clerkship.
So clerkship means that you're starting to do clinical work. So like the first 2 year medical school, usually you're in classroom and in workshops and things like that. But then once you're in 3rd or 4th year medical school, you're gonna be doing rotations with different specialties and actually in the hospital and clinics working along with the residents and your consultants. So in Australia, it's the same. However, I'm sure your viewers know this. In other countries, it's above clerkship or medical students or senior medical students, there is a level of internship. And then there's junior house officer. And then that's very Commonwealth, kind of a UK system. And a senior medical officer. Then you get into the people who are in the specialty program. So what that means that you're not going to be, it's not your turn yet. I'm sorry. You want to do this lumbar puncture? Oh, you want to hold the scalpel for me? Or you want to stitch it up? No, there is the SHO, the JHO, the intern, and then the medical students. So I've heard your talks, Dr. Hilsden, about medical student scrubbing in first, washing their hands, all the hierarchy that potentially come with medical practice. Imagine you're in a system where there's 4 more layers between you and the student.
Well, here's an example. Like today, I was in the operating room. I had my senior resident, and so in Canada, a senior resident, at least for general surgery, is a third, fourth, or fifth year. So it was me and the senior resident, and the next person was a medical student, third year medical student. So you can imagine what great opportunities there was for that medical student in the operating room because there's nobody else. So it seems like there's a real difference between. I mean, there must be just more people at the end of the day because sometimes I can't even find an assistant. Yeah, right. It's not uncommon for me to be directly, using a medical student as my very first assistant. I mean, that's one of my jobs is to do that. So there's very clearly a different pattern. Once you're done medical school, I get the impression, at least in the UK system, and Australia seems to be more like that. The residencies are like really long.
Yeah, exactly. So like, let's say if you want to get into orthopedic or neurosurgery, for example, like you might have to do this internship in the house officer for 5-6 years before you enter a program, and then another 5 years.
So this is like a general medical program as a house officer. You're not even necessarily doing any ortho?
You'll be like the more senior you are, then you're going to be more concentrated in doing all those, but then you're still doing the medicine stuff. So everyone's
is there like a match system, or is there anything like that?
It is a match system as well. So so you're right though. There's still going to be a finite number of spots, but a lot more people. It is a lot more people, and I think that's it's very interesting, and that's one of the reasons why I didn't want to stay, was because I didn't want to compete again in that level. Again, each level, even though you may have a job, you can stay behind, you can get your PR. You still have to apply again. You have to apply again.
So one of the biggest challenges, and this is where we're getting at, is you train abroad. Coming back to Canada, I guess there are a couple options here. Is it really possible? Like, what would the job prospects be for someone who decided to do all their training overseas, like do a residency or fellowship in another country and coming into Canada, versus trying to get back to through the match, and we have the CARMS match in Canada, and there are specific, oftentimes IMG spots. So that's the term we use, international medical graduate. So talk about those two paths, or what really are the options for someone.
Yeah. First of all, like, the chance is like close to zero.
I mean, it's not zero. I mean,
for some specialty is zero,
because
like, there's no spots.
Fair.
There's some specialty where they don't even offer an international medical graduate spots. But there are some that you can,
like across the country. We're not even talking about just in Western Pacific. We're talking about Canada nationally.
Yeah, exactly. So for some years, let's say like they would not take plastic. They would not. There's no ophthalmology like IMGs, right? But some years they might. So I'll give you an example. For neurology, in my year, I think still is there 4 in the whole country for international medical graduate in the whole world for that year. They take 4.
Okay.
And so we have,
I mean that doesn't seem that many, but recognize like how many spots nationally would there be for neurology in Canada overall?
You mean including
Canadian? Yeah.
About 30.
30. Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, it's an important number to understand. I mean, that's 30 new neurologists a year across Canada, a country of almost 40 million people. Let's understand what that actually implies. So we generate 30 neurologists a year for a country of 40 million people.
Number might be a little bit higher now, though.
Well, I mean, we're in the ballpark. We're in the ballpark.
Definitely not more than 50, but yeah.
Right. Yeah. Which is incredible. But that is our system, and that's partly why once you get your foot in the door in the residency program, and certainly most specialties, not everyone, you're going to get a job. The opposite is true in things like orthopedics. There's definitely a brain drain happening. Lots of people go to orthopedics in Canada and end up working in the States. There's some of that happening in general surgery. Surgical specialties a little bit more often. It's a little harder to find that job at the end of the day. So people do end up emigrating from Canada to the U.S. to practice. But you can see very, very clearly, because the residency spots are so few, there are jobs available. But it also gives you the opportunity to carve your own way, which is pretty cool. So you apply through CARMS. Now, tell me a little bit about round 1 versus round 2. Is that a factor when you're international grad?
Not my year. I just applied through the traditional like first round where they would take like international medical graduate spot, the 4 spots I was telling you about.
My question is though, will some international spots open up in the second round if there's unmatched spots?
So it's the other way around. So if there's any Canadian medical graduate spot that is unfilled, then second round is a free for all.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
So an IMG spot that's unfilled could be filled by a Canadian round two.
No. The round 2 meaning that an unmatched Canadian spot will be open up to an international spot.
So there sometimes are a round 2 option as well. So you get 2 chances there.
Yeah.
So you can apply to spots that are dedicated IMG spots in round 1.
Yes.
And then there's additional spots available in round 2
if there's an
and there will be some unmatched spots.
Yeah.
Maybe not in your preferred specialty, but sometimes I do tell people, and this is my advice for anyone. If you want to practice in Canada, get your foot in the door, get into a spot first. You're going to find it actually easier to retrain than it would be to, I think, actually do training outside of Canada and try to get in. For example, I don't know, it's difficult. If you do residency in the States, to find jobs in Canada and get that opportunity, it's a challenge for sure.
Yeah, I think I want to answer your previous question about, let's say, like you're trying to apply to Canada if you did foreign training or you just medical education and then apply for residency here versus that you do all your training, residency, and become a staff somewhere else and apply. So I have a few colleagues in my department right now who didn't do any Canadian training, but they become associate professor, very well published, like physicians in their own country. They could apply and become doctors with the hospital, but they are fixed to the hospital. They cannot have their independent practice because they're not under the college.
Right.
So there are people who go down that path to work in Canada who never trained or did their residency here. So that is kind of another way that some physicians you might meet in Canada where it's like, hey, wait, how could they practice here when they've never done residency here? No, it's possible, but they'll be working in the hospital.
There are challenges. We have actually a question from Krista Byers here. I'm sorry I can't put them on the screen. I apologize for that, just based on how we're running the live stream today. But I'll read the question for everyone. It says, is it harder to teach someone from an international student education compared to a Canadian student? As in, do they learn differently, or is it more or well-rounded education from any school? That's actually a good question. Maybe I'll see what your thoughts are on that. Training IMGs in a Canadian residency program versus a Canadian grad. Do we notice any differences?
You mean when I train them? Can I notice any difference?
So if you have someone in your residency program that was an IMG, because you did your residency here at Western.
Yes.
I assume do they still take IMGs at Western? Yeah. So they might.
Year.
Yeah. So do you notice a difference in quality, maybe, or no?
I wouldn't say there's a quality difference. I think the biggest difference is understanding the healthcare system and the medical records.
Yeah.
And knowing, because the residents who start here, they already have 2 years of clerkship, knowing the system, how it works in the hospital, as opposed to somebody from a foreign country. There is much of a steep learning curve. I think they have a much steeper curve to learn from, but then eventually, though, after a few months or so, they're pretty much similar that way. And I think that also I think it's a bias in some way. The people who get selected, let's say the 4 neurology residents in the whole country got selected, they are pretty strong candidates to be selected at the end of the day. Right?
That was going to be my response, is that the people who are taking those spots are strong medical students. They're actually really, really good. And they're motivated people. They perform well. So I think if there's any weaknesses potentially in the med school they came from, those are being made up for by the talent and the motivation of the people who are doing
the personality of the person rather than the curriculum from their school. And then it's just like learning a new job. It's gonna be difficult for anybody. Some people pick up faster, some slower.
Yeah, and I will say there's even a difference from people who train at our medical school versus a medical school down the street. And again, it comes to those issues of the EMR. It comes to cultural issues. So somebody who's coming into general surgery in our program, who's worked with us, knows the cultural ins and outs of the Western general surgery way, which is definitely a unique thing. And so there is a little difference. But 2-3 months into it, that's the point of training. We're shaping them into the image we want them to be as far as doctors, and they perform very, very well. There can be language barriers. It sometimes comes up a little bit with not necessarily IMGs, but there are other paths like some foreign funded residents are a little different too. That's a whole other thing, not the topic of today's video. And there can be language barriers and things like that, which can be a challenge. Although I'm interested to actually hear a bit more your story when it comes to that, because my understanding is that IMGs, even if they're Canadian born, have to go through this and maybe they're not doing this anymore, but there's this cultural training. Tell me a bit about that here.
Yeah. So once you're match, before after you sign your contract, they put you through a 4 or 6 weeks course all in Toronto, and then you meet all the IMGs in the province, and then you have to go through workshops and lectures on communication, ethics, abortion, breaking bad news. So just to ensure that, hey, these doctors that we have chosen could communicate and work in the hospital system in Canada. And as you know, in Canada, we are very diverse, and then we are very inclusive, so that it might be very different in other countries where they're trained. So it's quite interesting, because that course turned out to be very easy for the Canadian who study abroad, but more difficult for the true international medical graduate. And I think that there's actually, within the international medical graduate, there's two groups. One is the true international medical graduate.
Right.
They're not from Canada, but there are these Canadians studying abroad. We call it CSA, which is they're born and raised here. They did all their education here except medical school. So they would understand the whole system of going through that communication course, basically. That's
they would really kind of get it. And I do know people who would kind of make fun of it if you're a Canadian grad. This is ridiculous. I can't believe. I remember one guy was saying they had actors that were imagine them training about how doctors should communicate. And the guy used the analogy. He's like, imagine Tom Cruise training a fighter pilot how to fly a fighter jet. And that was the joke he was making. It's like you're having an actor train a doctor. These are actual doctors. They've graduated, and they're talking about breaking bad news and communication with patients. He's like, this is ridiculous. Now again, he was a Canadian who had trained abroad. And so, I sort of get his perspective on it.
Yeah.
Again, similar story. But there are these little steps. That actually goes to answer Chris's question a little bit, because there clearly was a need for that. Otherwise, the government wouldn't have invested in these training programs. So there definitely is a group of people who come through the international group that need it. Not the Canadians who train overseas, but people out there that might need to do it.
It's also it was actually a good experience, not only because there's a gap, right? People from everywhere, and also that you get to meet all these people. So then you were on. So
you didn't mind it. You were kind of I
did not mind it because you made it, and already you know this is just a course, and then you're in Toronto, and then you meet people. It's like, oh, you're from this school, so you make friends. Actually, I still keep in touch with the people that I met through that course, even though we never overlap with our training.
Okay.
And so it's because you're not in a competitive environment at that point. Right. Remember, in the beginning, it was, but that spot you're like, okay, we're on land now. Everybody, we're safe. Let's just have a good time. We're going to be
okay. We made it to our program.
Yeah.
That's great. So you matched your neurology. And then really at that point, like you said, you've made it. You there is no more concerns, or is there?
I wouldn't say there are no more concerns.
Okay.
So moving back and being the international medical graduate, I have to say there's a chip on your shoulder. I think that people would look at you still differently in some ways, I think. Or maybe they're not. Maybe you think that people look at you differently. And then, what I mentioned before, there's a steep learning curve, very apparent in the beginning. So you kind of self-doubt yourself in the beginning. It's like, am I worthy? What happens if I disappoint the program? Would they kick me out? And you also have a probation period for 3 months, too. So for the Canadian medical graduates, you don't have that. You just go straight into residency and you move on, right? For the international ones, even though you match, after you go through this communication course and all that, once you're in the program, starting July 1st, the first 3 months is a probation period. So technically, they could still kick you out if you don't perform well. So that 3 months was very stressful.
Like you had to program. Now, were you really worried though? I mean, you must have not. You didn't know.
I did. I was very worried because I was because I was slow. I didn't know neurology. Here's the other thing. Once you get into a program, and this is not a CMG or IMG topic, people expect you to know everything about that specialty immediately.
Right.
It's like, hey, you're a neurology resident, so you know everything in neurology. But listen, it's my day one, like first week. I know as much as you are, who's in trauma surgery, of neurology, right? So I think there's different levels of expectation once you start, and then over time it obviously got better, and then there's still exams though, right? Like you still have to write your medical exams along the way, which could be stressful.
But you're on the same footing as everyone else at this point.
At one point.
Yeah.
At one point
now you're there.
Yes,
now you're
yes.
there.
Yeah.
So let's take it back. So that's your story. And then, I mean, let's finish your story. Sorry, before we do that.
Yeah.
You're now an assistant professor here at Western, like myself. What was the journey from residency to here? And just to kind of wrap it up, how that ended up working out for you.
Yeah. So actually, this is actually really relevant. I did my residency training at Western, 5 years neurology program. But because when I was in Australia, I knew that it was going to be very difficult for me to come back to Canada. So I had backup plans. So I did all my USMLE, so meaning the US medical license exam. And I also applied to the US as backup. So I got like Chicago, Boston, Phoenix, all those places lined up for interviews. I went for all those interviews. But because the match in Canada started first, so if I get match in Canada,
you just didn't.
They kind of just they won't include me in the U.S. match. Why is that relevant? It's because I have all those. I passed all those exams. So once I'm at my end of my residency, I was like, wait a second, I need to think about, is there a fellowship I want to do? I have USMLE all passed. I'm eligible for basically any programs in the U.S. if I want to do a fellowship for. So that's why I started applying. Long story short, and then I was interested in headache medicine, and then applied to Stanford. And then because there are many places, another thing for our viewers, there are many places in the U.S., even though they may not require the USMLE, but states like California, places where people want to go and do training, like they have a lot more criteria. So the more you have in your CV and portfolio, the much easier for your application. So that's why I went there for my fellowship. And then I want to come back and serve the population in Canada for obviously headache. And Western was a good place because I did my training here and I built a lot of relationship here. And that's my long story short.
Yeah, no, Western's a great place to work for sure, and great opportunity for us academically, and we're able to do other interesting things. Interesting about the USMLE. So I actually don't really advise med students in Canada to do the USMLEs. I'm like, it's a distraction. Like, why you're going to want to match to residency in Canada? But you actually did the USMLEs. Really, that was actually almost fortuitous in some ways, right? Because I would say the majority of Canadians don't bother, but that opened up doors for you in the long run. Really,
not only that, but because I was studying so hard for my USMLE, I was so knowledgeable in my second and third year. And because USMLE has multiple steps and there's just so much content. So when I was working in the problem-based learning in medical school, I knew everything ahead of everyone else. So I was actually that was the point in my life where I was smarter than everyone else, was when I was preparing for this exam. Did I have a life while I was studying this? Of course not. But that was the trade-off. But I was like, wait a second, I'm actually the smartest one in terms of knowledge, knowing everything because of this crazy exam.
It's an interesting comment you made there. Like at that point, you were the strongest student, the smartest one of all the people you worked with. It's amazing how true that is, because you could probably stack up your career to 90% of those people on your graduate day in Toronto, and you've had a more successful, impactful career than they have in all likelihood. Like if you really think about it, as far as where you're at academically as an academic neurologist, your publications, the fellowships you've done, those things really are going to exceed that's a 90th percentile career in medicine for sure,
Mm-hmm.
for sure. So it's strange how that is. So you look back and like that was a barrier. Those were moments of depression. You said that was one of the saddest days of your life was the end of grad because all the people had performed better. But in actual reality, I can tell you right now, what you've accomplished in your career exceeds 90% of those things.
Yeah, I think that's why when I look back, right, I feel like, is it a mistake or is it a learning? I think they made me like who I am today, right? So I feel like for the viewers who are struggling with med school application, not sure where you're going, it's okay. I think there's going to be bumps along the ride for medical career. Let that be CMG or IMG. It's not going to be a smooth path. Even though if your parents are doctors, the director for the hospital, it's not guaranteed. And sometimes people might have to take a detour. And I think that detour sometimes may be a better path for a certain individual. That's the way that I kind of would advise to people going through application or that journey right now.
It's not totally a closed door. It's not a roadblock. It's a detour that might, in the end, benefit you in some ways that open up the door to a fellowship program that's a very well internationally recognized fellowship, which helped you get an academic job, which has led to many other opportunities, truly both academically. You've got a really interesting career where you contribute to people's health in a lot of different ways. And so these opportunities have opened up because of those experiences. And so I think that's one of the really awesome things about sticking with it and making those decisions to persevere. We're going to get close to the end here, but I wanted to get a sense. Do you have any specific advice for someone who's facing this challenge of going overseas to train if you want to come back and practice in Canada?
Yeah. So first off, I think choosing the right country with a school that has a good reputation for people getting matched back in Canada, if that's where you want. And then US also consider that can you come back to North America to practice. Two is it was very difficult during COVID times where people trying to do elective and rotations to really set up rotations to do, even if it's not related to the specialty of interest, but any Canadian exposure experience, and then have a reference letter from the preceptor you work with.
Did you have opportunities to come back to Canada during your clerkship?
I did. So I did a rotation here at Western. I did a rotation at Hamilton, and I did a rotation at rural Ontario at the Koken, which is like nobody really knows where that is. And then I also have some US experience. So I was able to organize my rotation so that I actually had the opportunity to do multiple overseas rotations. But again, that's very program specific to the medical school you're in as well. But you must have some rotations here.
Now, this may be a bit personal, but was there any strategic choices when it came to neurology versus some other opportunities? Did you say to yourself at some point, well, there's IMG spots consistently in neurology, and if I set myself up for success in neurology, then that may be the opportunity for me. Like again, it's a bit personal. Don't get me wrong. I didn't start off as general surgeon. I started off in family medicine, retrained. So there are, you sometimes take a different path, right?
Yeah.
So
I was going for internal medicine the whole time. So like I was doing internal medicine rotations like overseas. I did not do any neurology elective until my 4th year in the US. And so I was applying for both neurology and internal medicine. So kind of going through, not just when you're international medical graduate, you have to cast your net a little bit wider. Okay. And then you have your preference. And then neurology obviously first, but internal medicine takes more applicants. And then so that it makes more sense. There's not a single international medical graduate would say that I'm going to only apply to one specialty because the chance is so low. So you really have to it's okay because people do, when they look at your CV, they know that you're an IMG and there's no way that you could just have all your elective and rotation to be in one specialty. It's so hard to line that up. Yeah. They know that, you know what, as long as you have exposure here, and then you're at least in the medical side, not the surgical side, at least like you focus on that. Like a lot of my reference letter actually came from internal medicine doctors, not neurologists, for my neurology program. So that's kind of the other advice. And have backup plans. I think that you want to apply everywhere and then also apply, let's say that US, I have a lot of colleagues who did their med school in the US, stayed in the U.S. or came back to Canada as well. So don't close doors. Just keep opening more doors along the way. And you never know the odds against you, but it's okay. Like the moment you decide to go away, you got to start to kind of plan, work harder, continue to apply, continue to write those exams, and then eventually you'll be somewhere. And if you persevere, you're gonna succeed. I think that's the path of doesn't matter if you're an IMG or CMG. It might be much harder in the beginning, but there is light at the end of the tunnel.
I think the majority of people who are very committed to the career in medicine find a way. You know, if you're that passionate about doing medicine, unless you're really misevaluating your skill set as far as your ability to perform on academically, because that could happen where you really think you are capable academically and you're not, but that's very rare. People who have barriers, I know several people who've had 4 to 5 applications to Canadian medical schools before they get it. Now it's a different path than yours, but they made it eventually. They found the right combination of experiences, and that's grades, MCAT, master's degrees, those types of things, to get them over the hurdle to make it in. And those people are some of the most incredible, motivated, compassionate doctors I've ever seen, because it means something special to them. It's this part of the core person of who they are. And those people make fantastic doctors. They're not in it for really any extra motivation other than to be the best doctor they possibly can. Not everyone's going to be that way, but when you can be that way, that's pretty awesome. So I always encourage people, if your passion is medicine, you're having doors get closed in front of you, don't give up. International medical graduate or the foreign route is a possibility. There's always ways you can improve your performance or your academic standing in Canada, for sure. There's ways to improve your grades, your MCAT scores, all kinds of ways you can level that up. So I really strongly encourage people to stick with it if that's absolutely your passion. Well, we're just about to close. Do you have any last closing words of either encouragement or advice for someone who's in a similar situation as you? Maybe they're seeing those doors get closed and they want to, still pursue medicine despite rejection here or there.
Yeah, again, surround yourself with people who can support you, right? Like I feel like that's very important along the way, because it's not going to be a smooth ride, and you're going to feel down and depressed sometimes. And having the right people to tell you, hey, you know what? Like I know that this is. I know people who study there. They have success. That's how I went to Australia, right? Like I would never heard of it until my friend told me about it. So keep talking, keep listening, and persevere. I think that honestly, at the end of the day, we're sitting here together, working in the same hospital. One went through the Canadian system of training. I went in a huge detour, but we're still sitting here in the same room. And I think that's the way that you look at it, right?
Yep.
It's a marathon, rather it's not a sprint in medicine.
We're both teaching at a medical school that was too good for us as undergrads at the end of the day. But I'm proud to admit that, and I'm proud to take care of those medical students every day. And I think they learn something from me. I want to say thank you for everyone who's been sticking around and watching this live. Thank you for the people who are watching it after live. It's obviously available for you too. If you're not watching it live, leave a comment below. I like to respond to nearly every comment, and we can make additional videos to help you with your journey to apply to medical school in the future. My name is Dr. Hilsden. This is
Tommy Chan.
Have a great night.
Good night.